Hello, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby, and I'm also one of your chef instructors in your courses. And today is my open office hours, and it's your chance to ask questions that are related to cooking and your courses. And it's my chance to do my best to answer those questions. Okay. And let me mention just a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. On your screen, you're going to see the questions so far populated on the right-hand side. And if you're interested in participating a little more directly, you're welcome to leave a question or a comment. And you'll enter that in the dialog box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and that'll make its way to that list. Now, the other thing that I'd like to mention is that if you look at each question that's already populated, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. Now, if you would like a particular question answered sooner than later, you can click on the heart-shaped icon, and it'll push that question up in priority. Okay. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump in. And, what I'd like to do to start off with today is to address a topic of conversation first, and then I'll jump into the questions, okay, in just a couple of minutes. And I know that, many of you have just several days ago enrolled in the Forks Over Knives course. And some of you might just be getting started, and others of you in the other courses like Pro Cook and Pro Plant may have started recently as well. Now, as you get started with the Ruby courses, you're going to understand that our approach is one that focuses on really the foundational building blocks of cooking, and that is cooking methods and the supporting techniques in the kitchen. Okay, and recipes become secondary in our world, and so it's a bit of a change from the way that many people are used to approaching cooking, where the recipe is sort of their guiding light. Okay. Now, in our context, again, as you go through the lessons, you're going to learn about, in this case, cooking methods, moist heat methods, dry heat methods. Moist heat methods might include simmering or steaming, for example, that use water. And dry heat cooking methods don't use water. So deep frying, okay, as well as sauteing and grilling are examples of dry heat methods of cooking. And at the basis of each of these methods, and we think about cooking in general, okay, is going to be the control of time and temperature. That's really at the core of cooking when it comes to applying cooking methods. Of course, there are many other supporting techniques that are part of food preparation, but at the core, it's all about the control of time and temperature. So how much time are you going to cook this item, and how intense will the heat be? And those two variables need to be manipulated by you. So your job, right, as the student, is to focus on those two items as well as so much more. But think about those two variables as you practice. And also keep in mind that repetition is going to be very important to your deepening understanding and your growing confidence in the kitchen. Okay. And, another topic that I want to touch upon is a supporting technique. And this is this activity of heating a saute pan. And you're going to see lessons that focus on this activity, and we'll call it sometimes the mercury ball test or the water ball test. And basically, it's a tool of sorts. It's a way for you to begin to understand the pan that you're using and how it heats up. Okay, and the basic technique goes like this: you will put your pan on the burner and turn the fire on to a moderately low temperature, and slowly, as the pan heats up, you will put a small amount of water, and we recommend about an eighth of a teaspoon, so just a couple of drops, really. And you're going to observe how that water acts and reacts in the pan. And you're going to do that in intervals as the pan heats up. And again, the way that water acts in the pan will change. And now, one word of caution: as the pan heats up to a pretty high temperature, if you're using oil when cooking, okay, you'll want to use a high smoke point oil, and then put just a small amount of oil to see if the temperature of the pan is under that smoke point for that oil you're using, or if it's exceeded the smoke point. And if it's exceeded the smoke point, you'll know it because the oil will burn and create smoke. Okay, now the other thing that comes to mind here is one of safety, and that is oils have a flash point. And a flash point is the temperature at which that particular oil will ignite. Okay. And every once in a while, rarely, thank goodness, but every once in a while, I will hear some feedback from a student that says, "Hey, I heated my pan up according to this water ball technique method, and I put my oil in the pan for sauteing, and it burst into flames." So understand that there's a safety concern at the high end of this temperature range, and that as we're working with this technique, right, of heating up the pan, we need to be careful as the pan gets very hot. And if it is hot, then pull it off the burner or turn the fire off. If you have an electric range, then just slide the pan off of the burner and allow the pan to start to cool down. If you want to hasten the cooling process, then you can actually add food to the pan off the heat, because the pan itself will be hot, still holding lots of heat, and then just start your cooking process. If you use that technique to cool down your pan, I do not recommend putting very small cuts of items like small dice or brunoise, because those things could burn. And avoid putting garlic and onion in at those high temperatures, because those things are very likely to burn. But larger pieces, which will be significantly cooler than the pan, will absorb the heat, thereby dropping the temperature of the pan. Keep in mind that at some point, you're going to need to bring the pan back onto the fire source to continue your cooking process. Okay. Do not place an overheated pan or a very hot pan into cool water, or do not put cool water into the pan, because you will risk damaging the pan. Okay. And that'll be most notable if you're working with a stainless steel pan, probably all of which today are made with layers of other metals like aluminum and copper that are sandwiched together, right, for even heat distribution. If you heat up the pan, put cold water in it, then you're going to risk warping those layers. Okay, so please don't do that. All right. So, and then the next part of this water ball technique that I want to talk about is that it's intended as a temporary technique or tool of sorts for you to use as you learn to heat up your pan. In other words, while you're going through this exercise, please engage with what's happening and feel the heat of the pan, right? With the palms of your hands on your forearms and also that radiant heat on your face so that you can start to put these pieces together, right? The heat that you actually feel versus the sound that the food makes when you put it in the pan, as well as the other things that the food is doing in the pan, whether it's caramelizing quickly or burning or not doing anything, and so on and so forth. Okay, so your ultimate goal is to stop using the water ball test and to start cooking by feel. Okay. Also note that if you do not use a stainless steel pan, your results will look different than our video lessons, okay, which focus on stainless steel pans. Cast iron and other types of materials will not create the nice, clean, sort of mercury-like water ball that stainless steel does. Okay. And so if you're using other types of pans, then you're going to need to rely on feel even more so from the get-go. And go slow as you heat the water up, and go ahead and just add some food product to your pan to see how it actually acts and reacts in that environment. Okay. And then you can start to use your pan and learn how to use your pan just like someone that's using stainless steel. Okay, so that's my sort of introductory talk for those of you in particular that just started out in your courses over the last few days. Now, I'm going to transition to the questions for today's open office hours. All right, so to start off with, from Becky, who writes, can you show how to rinse quinoa before cooking and what the best strainer is? Okay, so I'm not set up to show you what that looks like here, but I can talk you through it. Okay, I'm going to start off by saying that a lot of quinoa these days on the market is pre-rinsed. So it's not always necessary to rinse it again. I'll leave that up to you though, okay? The next thing that I'll mention is that some of us out there have a very sensitive palate, sometimes across the board, but sometimes when it comes to particular tastes and even aromas, as far as our nose is concerned as well. And one of the tastes that some people are particularly sensitive to is bitterness. And those saponin compounds on the exterior of the quinoa grains are bitter. And after, I should say, for the store-bought items that are pre-rinsed, sometimes people can still pick up bitterness, in which case you want to go ahead and rinse that again if you would like to, okay? But otherwise, if your preference is simply to rinse quinoa, or if you're buying quinoa that has not been pre-rinsed, then consider rinsing it. And you can do that by putting it in a bowl, and then just pour some water into that bowl, and you can let it soak if you want to, if you've got the time. And the timings vary quite a bit. I've never done actual tests on what the minimum time requirement is, but you can certainly see some results after just a few minutes, okay? In terms of a little bit of frothiness that comes to the surface. And then as you strain the quinoa, you need to simply use a strainer that has a mesh size that's smaller than the grains, okay? And I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here and say that in the kitchen, one of the most common sort of tool categories that we use is the strainer. And if you end up doing a wide variety of cooking, different styles of cuisines and so on and so forth, Um, I find that one of maybe the tool category that you end up having many varieties of is the strainer. Sometimes it's the diameter of the strainer. Sometimes it's with a handle or without. Sometimes it's a drum sieve with a straight edge to it, and then the the straining screen on top of that. Sometimes it is the size of the mesh to suit the job. And so in this case, if you go online, or if you run down to a nearby kitchen tool supply store, you can look at these different strainers and choose one that's going to be very tight, so that these small quinoa grains won't fall through. Okay. Now, if you don't have a strainer, then you can use cheesecloth. And I've even heard folks using a coffee press, um, which has a pretty fine strainer, okay, to strain the water from your quinoa. So give that a try, please. And you're bound to find some method that's going to work for your situation. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up is a question from Kathy, who says, I need help on knife sharpening, please. I have Wüsthof knives that I sharpened using the Ruby instructions. They are better, but still not back to the wicked sharpness of a new knife. Is it possible to return a knife to that original sharpness? So let me answer your last question first with an enthusiastic yes. You can absolutely sharpen your knife however you want to. And it's really going to be based upon one's skill. Okay. Now, I am going to approach your scenario here with the assumption that we're using whetstones. Okay. And in this scenario, the first thing I always say is that whetstones have a learning curve, and sometimes it's long, and sometimes it's a sharp learning curve that we get to figure out. And I always recommend to students also that if you're going to start using whetstones, that you consider a practice knife, right? One that you don't mind sort of beating up, so to speak, as you learn to use the stones, because stones can inflict pretty quick and severe damage to a knife if they're used improperly. Okay. The results can be astounding. But on the other hand, once you learn to use whetstones, the results can be fantastic. And so it sounds like, Kathy, that you're somewhere still on that learning curve. I'm not talking about damaging your knife at all, but if you've experienced a sharper blade than it was, but not as sharp as it was brand new coming from the factory, then I'm guessing that you would benefit from more practice. Okay. Now, in terms of things to keep in mind, I happen to have a knife within reach here, and you get to choose the angle, right, at which you apply the bevel to the blade. And if you look at the blade here, right along this edge here, you can see it's a little bit shinier. Okay. That's the bevel, and that's the cutting edge. And that's what we're working on. And as you adjust your angle on the stone, you can create a bevel that's very wide, or you can create one that's much sharper. And that's going to reflect the sharpness of the blade, as well as how long the edge may last, okay, before it needs sharpening again. And very often, we'll say, hey, shoot for something between maybe 15 and 20 degrees off of the stone. Um, and that's probably a good place to be in. We're typically going to sharpen evenly, okay, on either side, at least with most knives. Okay, some knives have a single bevel, but with most Wüsthoffs and other European knives, you're going to have a double bevel that's even on both sides. And the other thing is when you apply the knife to the stone, all right, you want to keep the knife moving across the stone nice and evenly as if you were a mechanical jig holding the blade in place. In other words, if your knife starts to rock a little bit like this as you pull it across the stone, then you're going to develop rounded bevels, okay, which are going to feel less sharp. Okay, so your goal is to create nice straight bevels, but that requires that the knife really be kept nice and straight coming across, and at the same angle, nice and straight, flat, okay, coming across the other direction. And again, that takes a lot of practice. There are jigs that you can buy that will help you keep the blade at a constant angle coming across the stone. I don't use one. I know some people that do. I'll leave that up to you to experiment. Okay. But ultimately, it takes a lot of practice to get up that learning curve. And then it takes some repetition, right? Or sort of, ongoing practice, with some not so long time intervals, so that you can maintain your skills. Okay, because if you wait, for example, a year before you sharpen your knife again, then you're going to have to go through a little practice session again before that muscle memory comes back again. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, and I hope that's encouraging, because you can get there with practice. All right. And next up, we've got a question from Roy, who says, I would love to make a pizza crust that is at least partially made with cauliflower and doesn't contain oil like at Whole Foods. Aside from not having a professional oven with very high temperature, is there a special trick that I'm not aware of? Thanks. Yeah, so we've got a Ruby all cauliflower, 100% cauliflower pizza crust recipe, which is posted for you right now on your screen. And you can follow the link to that. And, this particular crust uses, it might use chia seeds um, as the binder um, for the small pieces of cauliflower, like that cauliflower rice, so to speak. It uses that sticky gelatinous substance as a binder. As you set it up on the sheet pan, essentially for drying. And you're going to line that sheet pan with a Silpat or some parchment paper. And while the recipe does not talk about lightly oiling the silicone baking mat or the parchment paper, you might consider doing that. Sometimes I have had better success with a light coating of oil. Otherwise, some of those gelatinous substances can stick even to a silicone baking mat. Okay, but that aside, just another comment that I'll make on this recipe is give it some thickness. Okay, so that the finished product has some structure, and that you can flip it or remove it from the sheet pan without the whole thing crumbling apart. And with most any sort of cooking, right, the repetition and experience is going to bring you deeper understanding and greater success. So be prepared to make it perhaps more than once. Okay. Otherwise, A household oven is quite adequate. Household ovens typically heat up to 450 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is plenty hot for any sort of pizza crust activity, and certainly for the drying that's called for this particular recipe. Of course, if you're using an oven with some relatively high heat, you're going to get some caramelization, some browning, which is also flavor as well on the finished product. Um, we've also had students that will use this recipe and but put it into a dehydrator, and that works as well. And so there's a couple of ways forward in terms of extracting the moisture, which is essentially what the baking process does, okay, in this case. All right, so please give that a try. And otherwise, you don't want to add oil to the cauliflower mixture itself, because that acts as a lubricant and acts against the binding properties of that gelatinous substance, whether it's chia seeds or something else that you might be using. Okay. Happy cooking to you. Thank you. All right. The next question. What's the best way to have spices cling to air-popped popcorn without the use of oil? Okay. This is kind of a fun question, because we do a lot of this sort of air-popped popcorn with spices here at home, as a very quick and satisfying snack. And what I have found is that dry kernels will leave a lot of spices at the bottom of the pan, and or the bowl, or whatever that vessel is that you're using. And the two methods that I have found success with is a little bit of oil or some sugar. So the sugar will melt onto the surface of the popcorn, and then the spice adheres to that. Okay. Perhaps there's a happy middle ground that you can work with. Or maybe there's just a different way that I'm unfamiliar with that you might stumble upon through your own experimentation. Okay, but those are my experiences to share with you today. Thank you. And next one is from Ruth, who writes, what plant-based meals or menus go best with edible flowers? Okay, interesting question. And I'm going to turn this around, okay, and consider this as what edible flowers go with plant-based meals or menus. And that's going to be, I think the question that I've, come across a number of times, and that's probably most common in the kitchen, okay, whether it's plant-based cooking or something else, all right? Edible flowers have some different aromas and different flavors and tastes. And, sometimes they're pretty mild, and they're not particularly noticeable. Other times they're bitter. Sometimes they're sour. And then, of course, they have different aromas that we're probably familiar with. Okay. And they really can go with a lot of different foods. Okay. Number one, edible flowers are used for a garnish, and in which case you can place a whole flower, at the edge of a presentation and serve it, or you can pluck the petals and sort of sprinkle those on top as a finishing touch. In both cases, they're probably not going to be very noticeable, okay, for the diner. And and so you might be able to use whatever you want, okay? But it's always a good idea to taste the flowers ahead of time. I recommend that with any ingredient that you're using. If you're not certain how it tastes on its own, go ahead and just put it in your mouth. I have always told my students, when in doubt, put it in your mouth, and just taste it. If you don't like it, you can always expel it. Okay, and that way you'll know if it's very sour or very bitter or just lightly so or something else. And then you can proceed from there. Okay. Now, another way to approach the use of edible flowers is as a more significant ingredient. And we will commonly see edible flowers incorporated into salads. And these would be of the um, leafy green style of salads. In other words, not a potato salad, right? But some sort of a tossed green or even a somewhat composed salad, but made of greens. And in this context, we can put in flowers, or again, we can pluck the petals and just toss those in the salad with the greens. Okay. And in a similar manner, also consider herbs. And they can be whole leaf or they can be torn leaves. You can just toss those in or fold those into a salad for some additional aroma and flavor. Okay, the other benefit with edible flowers is that they add a nice visual component to your food. Okay, now when it comes to hot items, um, edible flowers are usually used as a garnish off to the side or on top because they tend to be pretty sensitive to heat. And, they will wilt and discolor and otherwise look less than appealing, which is contrary to what we're trying to achieve with edible flowers. Okay. So, Ruth, in summary, think about a couple of things. Primarily, it's going to be the taste and how you might how the flour might go with whatever you're pairing it with, and you can also control some of that through sauces or dressings that you might use. Okay, and then think about the color or that visual aspect that comes along with the edible flowers. All right, thank you. All right. And another question from Kathy. How often should you sharpen your knives? Also, can you discuss use of the honing tool? Okay, so let me start with your second question first. Okay, so the honing tool we usually refer to as a steel, and it's going to be that long cylindrical tool. It's not always cylindrical, but often it is. Often made of metal, but not always. Sometimes they're ceramic. Sometimes they have a gold or a diamond dust adhering to the surface, and there's some different treatments. But nonetheless, that particular tool is intended to be used daily to maintain the cutting edge of your knife. Okay, so in other words, as you use your knife, okay, and we look at the cutting edge, this cutting edge will roll over with use throughout the day. And it depends on how much use you give it. Depends on what you're cutting, softer items versus harder items. It can also depend upon the material of your cutting board, as they will vary in softness or hardness. Okay. So as this cutting edge rolls over a little bit, your knife will start to feel dull. And so this is when we use the steel, okay, which is the daily honing tool or maintenance tool. And you're going to apply the knife to the steel in this manner. Okay, so you're going to try to replicate the angle of your bevel or cutting edge. Start with your heel, and as you pull the knife through, you also want to rotate the knife. So you're going to pull down as you rotate, okay? And then you'll repeat that on the other side, again, maintaining the angle of the bevel that you have put on the knife, and then you're going to rotate and pull that through. All right, excuse me a second. As you do, or after you do that, feel the edge. Go ahead and just pull your finger perpendicular to the blade in both directions to feel if it's even, okay? And if you have a kind of a smoother side, it tells you that it's rolled over in that direction. If your finger catches more, it tells you that, right, you're catching this edge that's sticking out. So you'll want to just lightly straighten that up again by applying your blade to the steel, okay? Until you feel it and it's even on both sides all the way up and down the blade, okay? Another question that I get every once in a while is, how many strokes on the steel are required, okay? And the short answer is one. All right. In order to straighten up an edge that's rolled over. If you can nail it with just one stroke, hallelujah, right? It's a good day. But usually it's going to take 2 or 3 strokes maybe on each side. You probably don't need to do more than that. I know that on TV, I can remember seeing these celebrity chefs that'll be gazing into the camera as they're just doing this off to the side many, many times because that's part of their show. Now, it's not a requirement. Okay. If you can just do it once, maybe once on both sides, you might have a nice, even cutting edge. Okay. Once you apply it, you also need to check to see that it's even. So again, if you see celebrity chefs doing all this fancy stuff off to the side and they don't even check to see if it's even, you know it's about the show, okay, rather than the function. And in my world, form must always follow function, okay? And so I hope that helps in terms of the use of the steel and what to look for when you're honing your knife on a daily basis. At home, usually once a day is fine, okay? Maybe as you're starting out your work. In a professional kitchen, if you're doing a lot of work on the knife, you might hone your blade multiple times, just as needed. Okay. Now on to the second part of your question, Kathy, about how often should you sharpen your knife? So when I hear sharpen, I'm thinking about stones. Okay, whether you're using an electric tool that has grinding wheels, or you are doing it manually on whetstones. Okay, that's sharpening, and that occurs as needed after you've used your knife enough such that this cutting edge has actually worn down. Okay, so that cutting edge you had, right, is actually worn down on the top, and your knife actually becomes dull such that the steel or the honing rod is ineffective. Okay, that's when you get to sharpen your knife. And so for home use, that might be once a year. It might be twice a year. For most folks, it's probably not more than that. Okay. In fact, it could be more than once a year in terms of that interval. Okay. If you're in a professional kitchen, think about twice a year as a starting point and sort of go from there. Again, just paying attention to when your knife needs to be sharpened. Okay. And then one last little word of caution. I mentioned earlier in today's program that whetstones can quickly damage a blade. So in particular, I'm talking about the coarse stones that we might start with if we really need to grind some metal off of the blade. Okay, usually we're not starting out with the coarsest stone, but rather just the medium coarseness, and then we're finishing with a finer stone to sort of polish, right, the cutting edge. I have seen knives that were sent out to so-called professionals who applied the stone probably to one of those large grinding wheels that a lot of professionals use, but a coarse one, and really ground down the knife. I mean, significantly, such that there was probably the equivalent of 50 years worth of metal extraction. And I'm not kidding you when I say that. Okay. So beware and choose your knife sharpener if you choose to send your knives out carefully. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up from Teresa. Hello. Why do some vegan recipes use oil and others do not? Or is cooking oil free the difference between plant-based whole food versus vegan? Ah, great question. I love this question because I think there are a couple of different facets to cooking or avenues to cooking that are sort of entwined here. Okay, so let me untangle these. Um, so the term vegan, all right, at least once upon a time, and I'm still one that adheres to this definition, okay, but once upon a time, when this term vegan came about, not only was it aligned with plant-based cooking, but it was also strongly aligned to the politics of meat eating. All right. So, and that had to do with the treatment of animals, and then so many other things. And we can talk about the environment and probably other things as well. Okay. But a big part of that was the ethics that were associated with the treatment of animals. And and so today, many of us use the term vegan simply to refer to plant-based cooking without all of the politics attached to it necessarily. Okay, I still associate the politics, and that has to do with my own background. But um, so when we see vegan recipes or vegan food, um, basically anything goes. All right, meaning processed foods, processed ingredients are very much a part of the history of vegan cooking. Okay. So in more recent years, we have seen the term plant-based come into use. And this idea of plant-based cooking is one that separates cooking from the politics of vegan cooking. Okay, if that makes sense. So we're really trying to focus on just using plant-based ingredients when we cook. All right, and then we've got whole food plant-based cooking. And this approach of whole food cooking, in this case with emphasis on plant ingredients, is one where we try to emphasize whole foods while we decrease processed foods or refined foods in our diet. Now, can I say decrease? Because for most of us, that's the reality. It's not the elimination of these processed or refined foods, but it's the decrease of those things to some level that is satisfactory to the individual cook. Okay. And this is where we get into some very interesting discussions. And really, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to you, the individual cook, right, who is concerned about your body and your family's health, to make the decision and to sort of draw that line or shape that definition around just what is whole food plant-based cooking, okay, for you, because it probably looks a little bit different than the definition that the next person uses. Okay. Um, Now, let's think about this. All right. To use unprocessed foods period, is super duper difficult. And if we were to maybe sit down over a cup of tea or coffee or whatever beverage of choice might be yours and talk about this, we might even find that, to start out at home with 100% whole foods is practically impossible for most of us. And I say practically, okay, because we've got busy lives and limited equipment at home and so on and so forth, right? So that on a more practical basis, which is hopefully what we're trying to find here, right? Because we want cooking to be convenient, right? We want it to be something that we can engage with happily and joyfully each day and each moment. We need to find that middle ground. And often that means incorporating some extent of processed ingredients in our inventory at home. Okay. Now, what that looks like is going to be up to you. Okay. So, I mean, if you want to do whole food vegan cooking, that's entirely possible. And in my book, that would include the politics of food. Okay. If you want to try to cut the politics out of food and just focus on the cooking part, then we call it whole food plant-based cooking. Okay. I hope that makes sense in terms of these terms. Okay. And some of the history around the usage versus some of the contemporary usage. Okay. Of these terms. Now, when it comes time for cooking that includes oil versus cooking that is oil free, that is an entirely different approach to cooking. Okay. Um, when we talk about oil free cooking, the first benchmark that we're usually talking about is to eliminate added oils. So, any oils that you might buy in a bottle that you bring home from the store. Okay. And, that is in itself challenging sometimes, but it's much more approachable for a lot of home cooks. Okay. Um, and then the next benchmark that some folks that have, um, I'll say, bigger health concerns to deal with may be to significantly eliminate fat from the diet, which goes beyond added oil to include some categories of fatty foods like nuts and avocados, for example. Okay. So this idea of cooking with oil or without oil, totally up to you. It's not related to plant-based cooking necessarily. All right. This idea of cooking with all plants you can do on its own with added oil of any sort or amount that you want. Likewise, as if you're approaching cooking in an oil-free sort of desire, also consider the idea of reduced oil cooking, right? Or maybe eliminating oil in some areas, but using a little bit of it in some places where it makes cooking more convenient. Okay, those are all individual decisions that you get to make. All right. And if you want to continue this conversation, please reach out to me at support@ruby.com, including the politics of food. All of this stuff is very, very interesting to me. But again, they come down to personal ethics and health concerns and other personal decisions. Thank you. All right. Tracy says, hi. I find it challenging to keep my middle finger knuckle against the blade and pinky and thumb holding the item being cut. Plus, hard to grip the items I'm cutting. Does the knife or height of surface matter? I'm petite. Tips appreciated. Okay. Let's see. Yes. So, let's start out with some of the ergonomics of cutting. Okay, the height of the surface makes a difference, and for the average person, right, in the United States is probably somewhere around what, 5'9" approximately. And so things in houses like counter heights are generally made to accommodate that person. And so if you're significantly shorter or taller, then things don't fit so well. Okay. So, the counter height is typically such that, your elbows are a little bit higher than the counter, and your arms are going to come down at a bit of an angle. Not too much if you're tall, or have to or have to hunch over, or not too flat or even angled up if you're shorter. Okay. Um, so if you find that you're on the shorter side of average, and your arms are closer to parallel, then you might want to figure out a way to stand on a platform to lift your body up so that you can get in a more comfortable position when you're holding your blade. Okay. Because first of all, your wrists, elbows, shoulders, neck, back, hips, knees, and ankles are affected by your activities in the kitchen. And certainly in a professional setting where you're doing a lot of volume and a lot of repetitive motion, those things can permanently damage the body. So please be aware of that. At home, for most people, most of the time, it's probably not a major concern, but certainly for some people, it can be. And so please be aware of that as you're setting up for your kitchen work. Okay. So, the kitchen surface, or relative to that kitchen surface, is going to be important. Okay. And try to grip the knife in this manner. Okay. And then pull your hand around the handle. It's going to move your hand up a little bit onto the blade, and it's going to give you more driving force and control, and a little bit less stress on the forearm. Okay. So that is considered important. Okay. In terms of using the knife. And, the other thing is, if you've got small hands and you're slicing something that's large or tall, you need to make adjustments. And it might mean cutting that item down a little bit further so it's not as tall or not as wide, so that you can hold it more comfortably and safely, equally safely, as you cut that item. Okay. And then the rest of it is going to be practice. It's going to be about finding a place that's comfortable. We're often going to rotate the body so it's at an angle. Our shoulders at an angle to the countertop, and I'm right-handed, so I'm rotating in this fashion as I use my knife on the cutting board. Okay. Or you might find, some other way of your knife versus your food moving across the cutting board. But so much of it is practice, and it's finding what's comfortable for you. If something, so as you're learning a new activity and holding your body in a different position and doing something new, you should expect some aches, right? That's reasonable to expect for new activities. But if things start to hurt, then that's not good. Okay. And so very often just a small pivot, rotation, different height, that creates different angles, can be much more comfortable and therefore safe in the long run. But again, in terms of the rest of the cutting, it's all about practice. Cutting is and developing knife skills, more precise knife skills, is one of the most challenging tasks in the kitchen. And even in most restaurants, prep cooks and line cooks have some pretty shoddy knife skills, in my opinion. But it's a difficult activity that takes a lot of practice. So the more you cook, And the more you are mindful about your knife practice, the faster you're going to move down that path of improvement. All right, so give those things a try. Thank you. All right, next up from Kim. I am taking this course to learn about leading a plant-based whole food lifestyle. I will not be turning in assignments or taking the exams. If I come to a graded assignment, do I just move on from it to the next task? That's a good question. You know, in the end, you know, you will have you know, access to the content. So you know, if you don't mind, you know, seeing a low course progress score, you can just skip over things. If you want to bring some sort of greater sense of completion to the course, then you can insert placeholder photos, and it could be of your cat or something else, into your assignments, and just upload those. And then, you know, where there's an explanation that's called for, just include some brief sentence that says, you know, I will not be including an explanation. And then just submit that. Your grade will be a 0, and then just move on, you know, through the next tasks. That's going to provide a more sort of a completeness to your course. Okay, I hope that helps. Thank you. All right, Mary asks, do you press tofu before or after you freeze it? If you are going to use a firm, you know, extra firm, sometimes medium firm tofu, after freezing it, you know, I would recommend pressing it. I mean, arguably you can do it either way, but what happens with unpressed tofu is that when the water freezes, it expands, and it's going to push apart that curd structure. And you're going to end up with a slightly looser texture, right, in the finished product. If you can press some of that water out, then you're not going to have those forces working against the structure of the curd as it freezes. Okay. But you might try it either way and see if you might prefer one or the other, depending on how you will use the end product. Thank you. And Mary asks, how long does tofu last in the refrigerator after opening? You know, upwards of a week. It kind of depends on the tofu. The higher the water activity levels, in other words, the higher the water content, the greater the opportunity for bacteria to do its work. And we're talking about spoilage bacteria, okay? And so if you have a drier tofu, like an extra firm tofu, those may get you past a week. Some of the wetter tofus may get you less than a week. Now, I think it's important that, you know, as your tofu reaches, you know, 3, 4, 5 days, that you're using all of your senses to determine whether it's still good to eat. And start by smelling it, because it'll develop an off smell. Go ahead and touch it, because it'll develop a different sort of almost a slimy texture. That the surface starts to break down a little bit, and so it has this change in texture. And then if you leave it long enough, you'll see some discoloration. Okay, but by then you'll be smelling it. And the other thing is, if you're going to store an open container of tofu, replace the water each day Whether you use the tofu or not, just pour out the old water and put fresh cold water in the package in whatever container you're using, and then return it to the fridge. And that will prolong the shelf life. Thank you. Melissa asks, is monk fruit sweetener considered plant-based? Aha, so this is kind of related to the earlier question, right, around the vegan cooking and whole food plant-based cooking and so on and so forth. Monk fruit comes from a tree, right, from a plant. So yes, it is plant-based. Now, the monk fruit sweetener that I typically see in the US is a highly refined powdery substance. Okay. That's not whole food, right? It's not an example of a whole food, but it's certainly plant-based. So whether you want to use that or not is totally up to you, right? It just depends on what sort of a food ethic you want to develop around the food that you eat. Okay. Now, if you're dealing with monk fruit, the fruit straight off of the tree, then that's going to be a whole food. And so we have a different conversation. Okay. And this is going to be true of, other ingredients, right? I mean, you get to call the shots on whether you want to, eat the product or not. Okay. And certainly if it comes from a plant, it's plant-based, but we have this other filter or this next question of how processed is it? How refined is it? And do I want that to fit into my plant-based philosophy around food? Okay, I'll leave that to you. Thank you. All right, and the next question from Marcia. I made a great roasted kale salad with cranberries and almonds, dressed with a lemon mustard vinaigrette. All great, except despite taking out the large stems of kale and massaging it all, parts were still too stringy to serve to anyone. Any suggestions? Well, so you can try to use younger kale. Definitely, as these leafy vegetables mature, the fiber and the stringiness gets more robust. And so that's going to be, one way to do that. You can also, tear it or cut it down. You want to cut it against the grain of the fibers. And, so if you have the leaf that grows out this way and the fibers basically growing out in this direction, then you want to cut it across the grain so that you're shortening the length of these fibers, okay, which makes it a little bit easier to chew. On the other hand, if you were to cut it this way along the fibers, even though you might still have the same thin strips or pieces of vegetable, you're going to have these long fibers intact, and you're going to be chewing on stuff and eventually pulling it out of your mouth and placing it on the rim of your plate, right? And so take into consideration how the maturity of the leaf, and then also how you might tear it or cut it. All right, thanks. And next up, yay, thank you. I'd like to rock. I appreciate your feedback. Thanks so much from Paris. Excellent. Thanks for joining me today and all of us for this live event. And Vanessa writes, I'm a chef educator and nutrition coach and recently launched a coaching business. Congratulations. My question is how I can partner with dietitians as an additional resource for patients. So, this is one that is really going to be up to you and the relationships that you're going to cultivate with the dietitians that you come in contact with, and try to align with somebody or some folks that who themselves embrace the type of cooking that you do. And maybe you're plant-based and that becomes important, or maybe you're not plant-based and you can find a more mainstream dietitian. But nonetheless, find somebody who uh, sees the benefit of not only eating, but cooking, so that you can then start talking about collaboration and working with the patients of the dietitian to teach them to cook. All right, and so really, it's a progressive conversation and a deepening of a relationship, with the dietitians that you meet, to find folks that are really in alignment or with you, that are in alignment with you on these things that are important to you. Okay, and it sounds like as a chef educator, at the heart of that is actually cooking. Okay, thank you. Next up from Tracy. So does the liquid that's being added to deglaze need to be heated first or at least room temp? This is a great question. As we add liquids to a hot pan, whether it's for deglazing or for absorption, such as with the risotto cooking method, those liquids will cool down the pan. Now, if you're adding a small amount of liquid relative to a very hot pan, then it's not going to make much difference because that small amount of liquid is going to heat up very quickly. And you'll be able to move on, with your cooking. But if the volume of liquid is relatively large, then it's going to have more opportunity to cool down the pan. Sometimes that's a concern. Sometimes it's not. Okay, if you're able to bring the temperature of the pan up again relatively quickly, okay, no problem. Certainly, if you're using a warmer liquid, and I'm going to use the example of the risotto method, right, where we add a liquid little by little to the rice or to the grains, and we'll add liquid and allow the grains to absorb the liquid. We'll add more liquid, allow them to absorb the liquid, and then continue that process until we reach the level of doneness that we desire. And in that context, we usually recommend that the cook use a warm or hot liquid. So you're going to have that in a separate pan off to the side. So when it comes to deglazing liquid, if you're adding just a little bit, again, say, a tablespoon or two, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you're adding a cup, then maybe to warm that up a little bit is going to help you along in terms of the progression of your cooking. Okay, give it a try, and just engage with the process and see how quickly the pan reheats. See how these different food items act and react, because different food items are going to give you a different experience. And then you're going to acquire this deeper knowledge and this broader understanding of how to handle time and temperature when you're cooking. Thank you. All right. And then Ellie writes, can you suggest any whole food, plant-based, quick, elegant desserts? I've tried melted 100% chocolate, 15 seconds, dip fresh strawberry or mandarin orange, peeled, whole, dipped to get all slices quickly, 1 minute to make fruit counters bitterness. Okay, yes, you bet. Chocolate dipped fruit, kind of in the spirit of fondue, but it's something that you control and you put those out. It could be a lot of different things that fall into that category. So yeah, excellent example. In a couple of our Ruby courses, we've got a couple of pies or torts that are based on chocolate that are plant-based, and they have nice nut crusts and some other spices and flavorings that go into the chocolate filling. And those are, they're not as quick as dipping things in chocolate, but they're pretty quick. And especially nice is that they can be made ahead of time and they hold very nicely. And they're elegant. And you can certainly dress them up as you plate them. So you can make them fit different occasions. And don't forget the use of edible flowers, which can really make the plating look beautiful. But that's a suggestion. And I guess in that same vein, you can take that filling and then present it in different ways. Like you can put it into a little parfait cup to make it present like mousse, or other edible or non-edible containers or vessels appropriate to the occasion. All right, so check those out. Thank you. All right, and then next question. How to make tofu from scratch, please. So this, I mean, the basic process is that you make soy milk, you strain the lees or the curds out, and then you add a coagulant to the milk, and then you set it. As far as all the details go, I would direct you toward, one of the many sources, probably on the internet or at your neighborhood library in terms of a book source. Okay, but that's the basic approach. All right, thank you. And next up, have you used purple pea flowers for cooking, dry or fresh? I just discovered I had some in a cabinet, and that they have antioxidants. Yes, I've used in a dry form in the past. And one of the things that are touted is their antioxidant properties. And no doubt a good food from that standpoint. But don't forget all of the other beautiful foods that have all of these other great phytonutrients that are found only in plants and benefit our bodies in so many ways, most of which are not yet understood, right, by the scientists. But don't wait to eat them, right? Don't wait until science tells us that they're good for us. Just know that eating a variety of plant foods, including spices, will benefit your health in the long run. And the short run as well. All right. Thank you. And the very last question of the day here. I'm getting bored with vegan, whole food, plant-based, instant beans, kale, tomatoes in an air fry, no sugar, fat. Any ideas to make it more interesting? So, it sounds like what you're talking about here is a particular kind of vegan or whole food plant-based cooking. And this is one that contains no sugar, or I'm guessing added fat is probably what you mean. If you are opposed to using added sugar and added fat, then okay, let's go down the path of exploring some global cuisines that will bring in different flavors and textures and bring some interest to your plate. Okay, that's where I always go. I just look at the rest of the world and find some inspiration. If you're game to use some sugar and fat at least once in a while, then that in itself can transform plant-based cooking, because things caramelize differently. They just are simply different with the addition of sugar and oil. But again, I leave that to you. But otherwise, take a look at the rest of our beautiful world and get to know different ingredients and sometimes different cooking techniques and methods, and expand that cooking horizon. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you again. In the meantime, I wish you happy cooking. Thank you very much.